Something changed in the energy system, but not in the way people usually expect. There was no announcement, no emergency press briefing, no visible signal meant for the public. Yet overnight, energy prices began to adjust. Not sharply, not dramatically, but precisely enough to matter. And that kind of movement does not happen by accident. When prices react without headlines, it usually means the decision was made earlier, somewhere the public does not see. Markets are not emotional. They are procedural. They respond to expectations, not explanations. That is the first thing to understand here. This is not a story about panic. It is a story about recalculation. For years, energy pricing has relied on a fragile balance of assumptions. Assumptions about supply routes, about political tolerance, about how much disruption the system can absorb before it has to acknowledge reality. When one of those assumptions shifts, prices don't wait for confirmation. They move quietly. That is exactly what happened. In the last several hours, energy markets adjusted in a way that felt almost invisible to the average observer. No sudden spike, no crash. Just small revisions layered on top of each other. But small revisions, when aligned in the same direction, are rarely meaningless. This kind of movement usually signals something deeper, a change in how risk is being priced. And risk only gets repriced when expectations change. That expectation changed when supply confidence weakened. Not because oil disappeared, not because shipments stopped, but because certainty did. In modern energy systems, certainty is everything. Traders don't need shortages to react. They react to probabilities. Refiners don't wait for disruption. They plan around potential disruption. Procurement teams don't respond to speeches. They respond to logistics. That is why this reaction matters. It tells us that the system is already behaving differently, even if the narrative has not caught up yet. What makes this moment unusual is not that prices moved. Energy prices move constantly. What makes it unusual is how they moved. There was no triggering event on the news cycle, no geopolitical shock announced publicly, no visible escalation. Yet the adjustment happened anyway. That tells us the response is internal, not performative. Markets are responding to actions, not statements, and those actions happened quietly. This is where timing becomes critical. Overnight adjustments are not random. They occur when liquidity is thinner and signals are clearer. They are less about emotion and more about positioning. That is why professionals pay attention to them. This reaction happened during a moment when public messaging remained calm. Officials spoke of stability. Energy availability appeared unchanged. There was no sense of urgency communicated outwardly. That contrast matters, because when markets move in one direction and public messaging remains static, it usually means coordination is happening behind closed doors. And coordination without explanation is almost always about risk containment. This is not the phase where systems fail. This is the phase where systems protect themselves. Behind the scenes, pricing models are being adjusted. Delivery timelines are being stress tested. Scenarios that were once considered unlikely are being reviewed again. None of this requires public approval. It happens automatically when confidence shifts, and confidence has shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to trigger response. At this stage, it is important to be clear about what is not happening. There is no immediate shortage, no collapse in supply, no emergency release of reserves announced publicly. Yet, what exists instead is friction. Small inefficiencies introduced into a system that depends heavily on predictability. When predictability weakens, costs rise quietly, not because anyone wants them to, but because uncertainty has a price. That price is now being factored in. This is why energy reactions often precede official explanations. Markets adjust first, governments explain later, sometimes much later, and sometimes explanations never fully arrive. The real question then is not whether prices moved. The real question is why they move now. Why this moment? Why this timing? Because movements like this only happen when multiple pressures align at once. Supply expectations shift, political tolerance tightens, and flexibility narrows. When those conditions overlap, the system responds preemptively. That is what we are seeing. This is still an early phase. The response is measured, controlled. But early phases are often the most revealing. They show intent before necessity forces disclosure. In the next part, we need to look inside that response, not at what is being said publicly, but at what is being done quietly. Because the most important actions in energy systems rarely happen on camera. They happen in contracts, in reserves, in logistics. And once those adjustments are in motion, reversing them becomes far more difficult than explaining them. What happens after the first quiet market reaction is never public. It is internal. When prices begin adjusting without explanation, institutions do not ask what the public thinks. They ask what their exposure looks like if the trend continues. That assessment has already started. Inside energy systems, the first response is procedural, not political. Risk teams reassess assumptions. Procurement departments revisit contracts. Logistics planners stress test routes that were previously considered stable. None of this appears on the news, because this phase is about containment, not communication. The goal is not to alarm. The goal is to buy time. Energy buyers begin by reducing uncertainty wherever possible. Spot market exposure is trimmed. Longer-term agreements are prioritized. Flexibility clauses are activated quietly. This is not done because shortages are expected tomorrow. It is done because uncertainty has increased today, and uncertainty is expensive. At the same time, reserve management strategies shift. Strategic reserves are not dramatic tools. They are buffers. When conditions are stable, buffers remain untouched. When confidence weakens, buffers are managed more conservatively. Release thresholds are reviewed. Replenishment timelines are adjusted. Internal trigger points are recalculated. From the outside, nothing seems to change, but internally, margins tighten. This tightening is intentional. It reduces vulnerability if conditions deteriorate further. It also limits how much exposure builds up in the system. That is why silence is necessary. Public acknowledgement of these steps would invite questions that do not have comfortable answers. Questions about long-term supply security, questions about dependency, questions about how resilient the system really is under sustained pressure. So communication remains minimal. Another layer of quiet response happens in financial markets. Banks and trading desks do not wait for confirmation. They hedge. Risk premiums are adjusted subtly. Currency exposure related to energy trade is widened. Counterparty risk models are updated. Again, this is not panic. It is recalibration. Energy markets are deeply interconnected with financial systems. A change in one feeds directly into the other. When supply assumptions weaken, financing costs rise. When financing costs rise, contracts become more conservative. When contracts tighten, flexibility disappears. This creates a feedback loop. Small adjustments reinforce each other. This is why early responses matter more than visible outcomes. At the policy level, this creates a dilemma. Intervening too early risks amplifying volatility. Staying silent risks allowing adjustments to become entrenched. So restraint becomes the default strategy, not because nothing is happening, but because too much visibility can accelerate the very instability policymakers want to avoid. Behind that restraint, coordination increases. Interagency communication becomes more frequent. Scenario planning expands. Contingency thresholds are discussed but not crossed. This is where the system is right now. Not in crisis, but not at ease either. This is the phase where systems stretch. They redistribute pressure internally. They search for flexibility. They try to absorb change without triggering reaction. But stretching has limits. Each quiet adjustment reduces optionality somewhere else. Each precaution narrows future choices. Each delay increases the cost of eventual intervention. This is how silent responses accumulate, not through one decisive action, but through many small ones. And each small action feels justified in isolation. That is what makes this phase dangerous, because it creates the illusion of control. As long as prices do not spike and supply does not visibly fail, the system appears stable. But stability built on adjustment rather than resilience is temporary. The longer this phase continues, the more behavior changes. Suppliers adapt to new expectations. Buyers plan around reduced predictability. Financial structures adjust to higher baseline risk. At that point, what began as a response becomes routine, and routines are hard to unwind. This is why the silence matters more than the reaction itself. Silence allows adaptation to proceed without resistance. It prevents early scrutiny. It delays accountability. By the time explanations arrive, the system will already be operating differently. That is the real function of quiet response. It is not about hiding a problem. It is about managing the pace of change. In the next part, we need to look at where this leads if it continues, because adaptation without explanation does not stop pressure. It redistributes it. And eventually, redistributed pressure becomes visible somewhere else, not in markets, but in behavior. That is where the story moves next. What happens when quiet adjustment continues long enough is not collapse. It is normalization. This is the phase most people underestimate because nothing appears to be wrong. Energy is still available. Markets still function. Life continues without visible disruption. But underneath that surface, behavior changes. Companies begin planning differently, not out of fear, but out of caution. Transportation firms revise cost assumptions. Fuel surcharges reappear under neutral labels. Delivery timelines include wider margins. None of this is announced. It is simply incorporated. Manufacturers follow shortly after. Input costs become less predictable. Supply reliability varies by region. Inventory strategies shift from efficiency to safety. This reduces risk in the short term, but it also raises costs quietly. Consumers rarely see a single cause. They see gradual pressure. Prices fluctuate more often. Discounts disappear. Choices narrow slightly. No moment feels decisive. But together, these changes redefine the baseline. This is how silent energy shifts reach everyday life, not through shortages, through uncertainty. And uncertainty changes behavior more effectively than crisis. Households delay purchases, businesses postpone expansion, investment becomes selective, growth slows not because demand vanishes, but because confidence thins. At the policy level, this creates an uncomfortable reality. The longer normalization continues, the harder it becomes to intervene cleanly. Early action risks being labeled overreaction, late action risks being ineffective. So adjustment is allowed to continue, quietly. At the same time, global behavior adapts. Other countries observe what is happening. They notice which responses are public and which are silent. They learn what triggers reaction and what passes without consequence. That observation shapes future decisions. Producers test flexibility. Buyers diversify quietly. Alternative systems gain usage not because they are ideal, but because they work. This is how structural change spreads, not through confrontation, through imitation. Once a new behavior proves functional, others adopt it without coordination. No agreement is required. No announcement is needed. That is why this phase matters more than any headline. Because once behavior shifts globally, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Incentives must be rebuilt. Trust must be restored. Costs must be absorbed. And all of that takes time. By the time explanations arrive, the system has already adapted. Officials may eventually speak of market conditions, of global volatility, of external factors. The language will remain careful, non-specific, because specificity invites accountability, and accountability is uncomfortable when change was allowed to proceed quietly. This does not mean the system is failing. It means the system is transforming. Transformation without transparency is not dramatic. It is subtle, and subtle change is harder to resist. The oil did not stop flowing. Prices did not explode. No emergency was declared. Yet expectations moved, behavior adjusted, and the reference point shifted. That is the outcome of silent response. It creates a new normal without forcing acknowledgement. This is why moments like this matter, not because they feel urgent, but because they feel calm. Calm allows adaptation to settle in, and once adaptation becomes habit, it no longer needs explanation. If this pattern continues, the next developments will not come from announcements either. They will come from choices, from where supply is secured, from how risk is priced, from which systems are trusted, and by the time those choices are obvious, the question will no longer be what happened. It will be whether anyone still has the leverage to change it. That is the real consequence of quiet energy response. Not crisis, not collapse, but permanence. And once permanence sets in, the system does not go back. It moves forward under new assumptions, silently.